Welcome back to Limit Break 20. In today's video, we're going to be going over the fundamentals of combat in Final Fantasy XIV Tabletop RPG. So, combat in Final Fantasy XIV Tabletop RPG isn't really too different than other tabletop RPGs such as D&D 5th edition. However, there are some nuances, so those are the things that I want to jump into. The first thing that we want to do is when we look at an encounter, we want to see how it's broken down. If you've ever played D&D 5th edition, you've heard the term let's roll initiative, and that means combat starting. So the way that encounters work in Final Fantasy XIV is that it is comprised of really two steps. There's one that's called the adventure step. Think of this as the player's turn. And then the enemy step, which is the enemy's turn. And then at the end of the enemy's turn is the end of the round step. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about what that means. But really just think of it as player's turn, enemy's turn, end of the round. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is going to be the adventure step and what exactly can a player do on their turn. So when a player takes a turn, they really have three things they can do. They can take a primary action, they can take a secondary action, they can have their standard movement, or they can replace their movement with focus. Those are essentially the three things that they can do, and we're going to dive into each one of those because there are a few nuances. So the first thing we'll talk about is the primary actions. Primary actions allow a player to perform one of several different tasks. The first is going to be a primary ability. They can use a primary item. They can sprint, which effectively doubles their speed for the turn, or they can perform any action specified in the scenario by the game master. Now, one thing that I really like about the primary action is that they also give you the option to use a secondary action instead. So this would be effectively the ability to take two bonus actions in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, which I could think of some sort of niche situations you'd want to do that. But the fact that you can do it is really cool. Some primary abilities have something called a combo ability. And what this is it's a special effect that allows you to take an additional primary ability. So this basically, think of this as in some cases almost like a multi-attack. You take the attack action, you get to take two attacks. It's a very similar concept, but as players level up, the combo abilities allow the players to have more flexibility in combat and what they do. So next, we're going to talk about secondary actions. And secondary actions allow a player to use a secondary ability, use a secondary item, or perform any action as specified by the Game Master or Crystal Bearer, as we call them on this channel. Now, one thing that's unique to notice in the rules is that there are a primary item and a secondary item. While there isn't a ton of guidance right now on what those items are, we can expect to have some more guidance on that when the standard rulebook gets released next year. So next, we're going to go over standard movement. Now, most characters and players can move usually about 5 squares, which I appreciate. Thank you for just telling us it's squares and not giving us feet or, God forbid, use yalms from the video game. That'd have been horrible. But with standard movement, it's very similar to most other tabletop RPGs. You move a certain number of squares, which is pretty straightforward. Don't think I need to dive too much into that. What I will do is I will go over an example of moving between enemies or characters that are larger than you, because there are some unique mechanics with that. So one unique rule that Final Fantasy XIV has when it comes to movement and character size is that characters that take up one space, like a small or medium-sized character, can't move through another smaller medium-sized character space. However, any character that's larger than that smaller medium, so taking up a 2x2 or a 3x3 square, can move through a character space. And in addition, the game master will move them, the players that it moved through, the smaller characters, and knock them prone. So there is sort of a size mechanic that I like where something can kind of barrel through and either knock you prone or you not get prone. Can't really think of a situation where you're going to be bigger than another 1x1 square, but of according to the rules, it's possible. There's one additional rule that I want to talk about in regards to movement, and it's called focus. So players have the ability to forego all their movement on their turn to take a secondary bonus action for free. So this is very similar to the steady aim feature that Rogues got in sort of the updated D&D 5th edition rules, where you can forego all movement and get advantage. The difference is you forego all movement and you get a second bonus action, which is kind of unique. In fact, I was playing a game with one of my player characters who was a white mage, and there were about 4 enemies that were on the map. And what he did is he sacrificed his primary ability to cast a bonus secondary ability. And then he also stopped moving, used a secondary action, and then used Swift Cast to cast Arrow on all 4 of these creatures just to get the damage over time proccing as early as possible in the combat. So that was a really cool use of the abilities. And that's one of the things that I really enjoy about combat in Final Fantasy XIV is that there is a lot of optionality in what you do. And the fact that sometimes as a melee character, you're stuck in combat fighting, especially if you're a tank, fighting the big bad enemy, or maybe you're the Dragoon that's flanking. And now you can look at, okay, I have a list of secondary abilities. If I don't move out of harm's way, I can use additional attacks and things of that nature. So really, really cool mechanic. And I think it's creates some creative uses of play. So one thing I'm going to touch base on, because I've covered it in other videos, is instant abilities. Instant abilities work sort of like reactions in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. What's unique about instant abilities, though, is that you can use them on other players' turns, like you could use them on allies' turns or on enemies' turns. The rule is that you just can't use multiple instant abilities on the same enemy's turn. So a pretty unique feature, something I really enjoy and think is cool, especially when you look at the Bard, because they're just basically an instant ability fighter, which I think is a very cool archetype. When it comes to using abilities, there's really 3 things to know. The first is that all abilities have something called a base effect, which means no matter what happens by using this ability, it's going to do something. In some cases, it's a flat 2 or 3 damage based on the ability used. Kind of think of this as the consolation prize, right? Now, the next thing that you have when it comes to abilities is something called a direct hit. So depending on your character's ability, you're either going to target their physical defense or their magical defense. And if you roll your d20 and then apply your modifier to hit, if you meet or exceed that defense number, then that is what's called a direct hit. And what will generally happen is that it's additional damage dice that are rolled or maybe some additional effect. The third thing that I want to cover when it comes to abilities is limitations. So this indicates how many times an ability can be used in a given period of time. And it also describes other restrictions or conditions. So it's really nice to know, okay, I can use this, so many times per encounters or phases. And that'll be something I touch base on a little bit as well later in the video is phases. So the next thing I want to talk about are critical hits. So this is pretty standard in most tabletop RPGs, but if you roll a natural 20 on the die, it's called a critical hit. So a critical hit is both a direct hit and a critical. And what that just means is that you double the damage dice. So in one of the examples they give in the book, and I actually saw this in one of the sessions that I ran for some players on Roll20, is the Dragoon had used the jump attack, hit a natural 20, and ended up rolling like 8d8 to kill an ad. It was pretty cool. So again, criticals, they exist. You roll nat 20, double the amount of damage die. You aren't doubling the modifier. Sometimes people think that that's the case, but it's definitely not. You're just doubling the amount of damage die. One additional rule that I want to go over is something called Proc Effects. So the best example of a proc effect, I think, is on the Bard character sheet. If you take a look at it here, what this shows is that if you use the heavy shot ability, it says that if the dice rolled on the ability lands on a 15 or higher, the following proc effects. And it says heavier shot, grant straight shot ready. So what straight shot is the second ability that you get to make an additional attack roll and do additional damage. So that's an example of a proc effect, is when you use an ability and whatever the rule or trigger point is for this proc effect happens, then you get to use that ability. So just an extra sort of cool thing where the what you roll on the dice matters. I think that that's a fun mechanic to bring in. So now that we've covered what, for the most part, player characters can do on the adventure step, we're now going to move into the enemy step, which is effectively what can the enemies do on their turn. So what you'll notice is that the it's going to be a very similar setup where enemies are going to be able to take a certain amount of movement, as well as they're going to be able to have certain abilities. Some abilities will combo into each other, some don't. It just depends on the enemy, on the adventure that you're running. But really, the most unique mechanic and the thing I wanted to go over most in this video is something called markers. So, markers serve as visual cues that provide advance notice of what is about to occur on the encounter map. When a marker is generated, an object or token should be placed on the encounter map to represent the marker. So there's really two kind of components here. First is the source, which is kind of a confusing name, but this is basically the ability that's generating the marker. Then there is the creator, which is the character that used the ability to generate this marker. So it can be a little bit confusing in the wording, but I think in this example that we're going to go over here, it's going to make some sense. If you look at the player's manual and you look at the marker resolution section, it's a lot of steps and it's very confusing. So what I want to do is actually show you guys an example of what this looks like using the samples in there kind of in combat. So the first thing is you can see what we're going to do is we're going to place the origin, which is a random square containing an enemy, right? So, okay, we know exactly where the location needs to be. And then what happens is we look at the marker area. So now we're going to take a 5x5 area that's centered on this origin, and the target is all enemies within the marker area. Now, probably the most important part is to pay attention to the marker trigger, which is the beginning of this character's next turn. And then what happens? Any character in that area deals 4d6 damage to all targets. So as you can see, we have this enemy who's going to place this marker on the black mage. And what's going to happen is this is going to resolve when this character's turn is next. So remember, from the beginning of the video, we have the adventure step and then we have the enemy step. Now, once the enemy step's finished, it's the end of the round. So this marker trigger, that damage isn't going to be dealt until the next, think of it, round 2 of the enemy step. So this actually gives players the ability to move out of the way for this particular ability. So now let's take a quick look at a different ability. And this one is going to be something that targets the enemy tank. So we're going to put this right here on the warrior. And as you can see, this is a mobile 3x3 area centered on the origin, and this is going to move with the target. So it doesn't matter if the tank moves at all, this is going to follow him. So if he takes a few steps back, that marker is going to move with him. Of course, this is going to target all the areas in the marker, and this marker trigger is at the beginning of the character's next turn. So again, enemy casts this at the end of round 1. Round 2, the adventurers and the players have the ability to kind of move around or reposition to get away from this additional damage that could be proccing on the beginning of the enemy's next turn. The last thing I want to go over in this video is just something that's called phases. I did touch base about this in my video about how to improve your D&D 5th edition game, but it's phases. And think of phases as sort of these narrative kind of checkpoints in the combat. So, for example, I think I've used this before. Let's say you're fighting the dragon and the dragon goes down, and then all of a sudden the dragon starts sort of, changing and swirling and becomes like a zombified version of the dragon. That would be considered, or I would consider it, like a new enemy phase. And what's unique about phases is that there's a couple of things to note. The first is that you remove enchantments and enfeeblements from all characters unless they're specified not to be removed. The second is that the game master places any additional enemies or the encounter map and adjusts the enemy character information as necessary. Now, the cool part is that adventures and companions with abilities that have a limited number of uses per phases have those restored. Really, really important for a character like the Bard, who gets a lot of their abilities restored during phases. And then turn order, HP, MP barriers, items consumed, and benefits gained, such as Umbral Mastery and Beast Within, are carried over into the new phase. So you're not losing some of those buffs that you may have put on yourself. And then one other final piece of it is that each adventure may immediately use one of their items. So, again, it's a really cool rule. I like this because it adds more narrative flavor and kind of creates a more dynamic battlefield. So, that's really the last thing I wanted to cover. And that was kind of it for the fundamentals. I know we sort of covered a lot of information in a little bit of time. There are some other rules that are pretty basic, like your HP drops to 0, you're knocked out, right? We can cover those in a later video, but I felt like these were sort of the having an understanding of the flow of combat really was something that I wanted to do, especially because I'm going to plan on making individual character videos about their abilities and kind of how to use those. But it felt a little premature to make those videos without at least talking about sort of these fundamentals of combat. So, anyways, that's what I had for you for today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to attune to this channel by liking and subscribing. And also let me know if there's anything additional you want to see, or if I screwed anything up royally, just tell me in the comments below. Until then, stay safe, adventurers.